October 24th, 1942, Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. 700 Marines dig foxholes in volcanic mud while watching the jungle tree line 200 yards ahead. Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Puller walks the line, his barrel chest wrapped in sweat-stained fatigues, checking every machine gun position along a defensive perimeter stretching 2,500 yards. The numbers don't add up. His 1st Battalion of the 7th Marines should hold maybe 500 yards at most. Instead, they're spread so thin a man could throw a grenade between fighting positions. The jungle breathes with tropical heat as Sergeant Ralph Briggs telephones from his forward observation post 3,000 yards ahead. His voice carries the weight of certainty. "Colonel, there's about 3,000 Japs between you and me. They've been all around us, singing and smoking cigarettes, heading your way." Puller knows what that means. 3 regiments of veteran Japanese infantry, seasoned, troops from the Sendai Division who conquered Java without breaking stride, are about to crash into a single understrength battalion defending the most important 100 acres in the Pacific. Henderson Field sits behind them, the only operational airstrip between Pearl Harbor and Australia. Without it, the entire Guadalcanal campaign collapses. Without Guadalcanal, the road to Japan becomes impossibly long. Tonight, 90 Marines with machine guns will face 1,500 charging Japanese soldiers in what military analysts would call a tactical impossibility. The defenders are outnumbered more than 15 to 1. Standard doctrine suggests retreat, reinforcement, or accepting defeat. But Puller's battalion holds something the Japanese planners didn't account for. An edge so complete it will transform the calculus of jungle warfare and leave 1,500 enemy dead by dawn without losing the airfield. The edge wasn't courage, though courage would matter. It wasn't superior, tactics, though tactics would prove essential. It was something far simpler and far more devastating. The edge was water. Specifically, the gallons of water circulating through the cooling jackets of M1917 Aoni, heavy machine guns, weapons, military planners considered obsolete, outdated relics from the trenches of France that had no place in modern jungle warfare. But as the sun set on Henderson Field that October evening, those obsolete guns would demonstrate a truth about warfare that every technological advancement since has confirmed. Sometimes the best weapon isn't the newest one. Sometimes the best weapon is the one that keeps firing when everything else falls silent. The morning had started like every other morning on Guadalcanal, with rain. Not the brief afternoon showers of temperate climates, but the relentless tropical downpours that turned foxholes into bathtubs and weapons into rust-prone liabilities. Private First Class Mitchell Page watched water stream off his helmet brim as he adjusted the traverse on his machine gun for the 100th time. The weapon weighed over 100 pounds, fully assembled with its tripod and water-filled cooling jacket. Every Marine in his section had complained about humping the heavy gun through jungle terrain where every ounce mattered. The newer M1919 air-cooled machine guns weighed 41 pounds by comparison. Lighter, more portable, supposedly better suited for the rapid advances that characterized modern warfare. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But Page had noticed something during training exercises back in Samoa. The M1919 gunners spent a lot of time not firing, waiting for barrels to cool, swapping out overheated components, watching that critical moment when metal temperatures climbed past operational limits and the weapon simply refused to function. The M1917 Aon had no such limitations. Its water jacket absorbed heat like a massive heat sink, converting thermal energy into steam that vented harmlessly into the air. The gun could fire continuously for hours if ammunition held out. The weight penalty that made it seem obsolete was actually stored cooling capacity that paid dividends during sustained engagement. Lieutenant Colonel Puller understood this on a level that transcended technical specifications. He had studied the machine gun's performance during World War I. Read after-action reports from Belleau Wood and Château Thierry, where these same weapons had broken German assault waves through sheer sustained firepower. The tactical environment in those French forests wasn't so different from Guadalcanal's jungle. close-range engagements where visibility rarely exceeded 50 yards, dense vegetation that channeled attacking forces into predictable corridors, situations where the side that maintained continuous fire held decisive advantages. The Japanese had been probing American positions since August, testing defenses, looking for weak points. Their standard assault tactic had proven devastatingly effective across the Pacific. Wait until darkness. Mass infantry in jungle concealment. Launch coordinated charges that relied on shock, speed, and overwhelming numbers to breach defensive lines before defenders could respond effectively. The tactic worked because it exploited fundamental limitations of defensive firepower. Rifles needed reloading, machine gun barrels overheated. Defenders eventually ran low on ammunition or suffered weapons failures. The gaps in fire created opportunities for attackers to close distance and overwhelm positions through hand-to-hand combat. Puller's defensive plan centered on eliminating those gaps. He positioned his M1917 Aoni machine guns at carefully selected points where jungle terrain created natural choke points. Each gun commanded fields of fire that overlapped with adjacent positions, creating interlocking zones where attacking forces would face continuous fire from multiple directions. The water-cooled weapons gave his gunners capabilities that lighter guns couldn't match. They could maintain sustained fire throughout an entire night-long assault. No barrel changes, no cooling periods, no critical gaps in coverage. The battalion had arrived on Guadalcanal on September 18th with the rest of the 7th Marine Regiment, reinforcing the 11,000 Marines who had captured Henderson Field 6 weeks earlier. Puller's first combat action had gone poorly. Japanese ships bombarded their bivouac area the first night, inflicting casualties before his men even saw the enemy. Days later, during the Second Battle of Matanikau, a good portion of his battalion became surrounded behind enemy lines. Only Puller's quick thinking, commandeering a destroyer and orchestrating an amphibious withdrawal under fire, saved them from annihilation. The battalion had suffered over 10% casualties in its first 10 days, losing the executive officer and all 3 company commanders. Morale had hit rock bottom. Division gave them no time to recover. On September 28th, Vandergrift ordered Puller's battalion to move up and replace another unit on the southern perimeter. The assigned sector faced dense jungle flatlands where previous units had barely begun defensive preparations. Puller immediately set his Marines to improving what they found. They carved undergrowth to create wide, interlocking fire lanes for machine guns and anti-tank weapons, positioned these weapons in bunkers covered by logs and sandbags, strung double-apron barbed wire fences and attached ration cans containing pebbles to detect intruders attempting to cut through the barriers silently. The riflemen dug deep, fighting holes along the entire sector, many with overhead cover, roughly 100 yards to the rear. They hacked out a path paralleling the front line so commanders could move from flank to flank without being observed. This narrow lane connected with dirt roads leading back to the airstrip. Every detail mattered because Puller understood something about defensive warfare that peacetime theorists often missed. Fortifications didn't just protect defenders. They multiplied the effectiveness of defensive fire by providing stable firing platforms and clear fields of observation. Staff Sergeant John Basilone commanded a machine gun section in Puller's battalion. The 26-year-old from New Jersey had served 3 years in the Army before joining the Marines, giving him more weapons experience than most men in his unit. Basilone had trained extensively on the M1917 Aone during his Army service and understood the weapon's capabilities intimately. He knew how to maintain proper water levels in the cooling jacket, how to adjust for thermal expansion during sustained fire, how to clear malfunctions and perform field repairs under combat conditions. Most importantly, he understood the psychological effect of sustained machine gun fire on attacking troops. The weapon's distinctive sound, a steady mechanical hammering that never seemed to stop, created psychological pressure that complemented its physical effects. Enemy forces, hearing that continuous fire, understood they faced a weapon that wouldn't falter, wouldn't pause, wouldn't create the gaps that assault tactics relied upon. The sound itself became a barrier as formidable as the bullets it represented. Basilone positioned his 2 machine gun sections to cover the most likely Japanese approach routes. He'd studied the terrain carefully, noting how jungle vegetation channeled movement along specific paths where visibility exceeded 10 yards. Those paths became his killing zones. By October 24th, intelligence reports indicated major Japanese preparations for another offensive. Captured documents revealed that Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, commander of the Japanese 17th Army, had arrived on Guadalcanal with substantial reinforcements. The general brought artillery, including 100mm cannon and 150mm howitzers, weapons the Japanese hadn't employed in previous assaults. More concerning, he brought veteran infantry from the Sendai Division, seasoned troops who had conquered the Dutch East Indies with minimal losses. These weren't the undertrained conscripts who had attacked American lines in August and September. Hyakutake's battle plan revealed both the sophistication and overconfidence of Japanese planning. He would launch a 2-pronged assault against American positions. The northern prong would attack Marines, defending the Matanikau River with tank support. The southern prong, commanded by Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama, would approach through the jungle and strike the inland section of the perimeter where Puller's battalion held the line. The plan assumed American defenses would crumble under coordinated pressure from multiple directions. Japanese planners expected to capture Henderson Field within 48 hours. The confidence wasn't entirely unjustified. The Japanese had captured Singapore, the Philippines, Java, and numerous Pacific islands through similar tactics. Their infantry had demonstrated superior jungle fighting skills and willingness to accept casualties that would devastate Western armies. The Sendai Division had never been defeated in combat. Its soldiers believed in their invincibility with religious certainty, but Japanese intelligence had failed to account for several critical factors. They didn't know about the M1917 Aoun machine guns positioned along Puller's line. They hadn't studied the weapon's sustained fire capabilities. Most critically, they didn't understand how water-cooled machine guns would perform in the specific tactical environment Guadalcanal presented. The afternoon of October 24th brought heavy rain. Water poured from tropical skies, turning the defensive sector into a muddy swamp where men slogged through ankle-deep water that filled foxholes faster than they could bail. Visibility dropped to 20 yards in the downpour. The rain created tactical problems for both sides. Japanese forces approaching through the jungle found their movement slowed by mud and reduced visibility. American defenders worried about weapons maintenance, knowing that moisture could cause malfunctions in critical moments. But the rain also created an unexpected advantage for Puller's water-cooled machine guns. The high humidity that plagued air-cooled weapons actually improved the M1917 Aoun's performance. The cooling jacket's thermal management relied on water's heat capacity, which functioned independently of atmospheric conditions. Rain that made the M1919 less reliable had no effect on the older weapon's operation. The weather that seemed like a disadvantage would prove another edge in the coming engagement. As darkness approached, Puller walked his line one final time. He checked every position personally, offering words of encouragement, verifying ammunition supplies, ensuring each squad understood their fields of fire. The battalion commander's presence reassured men who knew they faced overwhelming odds. Puller's reputation for coolness under fire had spread through the regiment despite the battalion's rough start on the island. He exuded confidence that came from experience and careful preparation. At each machine gun position, he spent extra time verifying the weapons were properly set up, water jackets filled, ammunition belts linked and ready, traverse and elevation settings checked. These guns would be the backbone of his defense. Everything else, the rifles, the artillery, the fighting spirit of individual Marines, mattered less than keeping those machine guns firing continuously throughout the night. Sergeant Briggs' 9:30 p.m. report confirmed what everyone had been expecting. The Japanese were moving, 3,000 troops, possibly more, approaching through the jungle toward the southern perimeter. The force vastly outnumbered Puller's 700 available Marines. Standard tactics suggested requesting immediate reinforcements, but division reserves were limited, already committed to defending against the expected northern assault at Matanikau. Puller's battalion would have to hold alone, at least for the first few hours. The colonel returned to his command post and studied his defensive map in the dim light of a shielded lantern. His sector stretched 2,500 yards, far too long for a single battalion to defend effectively. But the Japanese couldn't attack everywhere simultaneously. Jungle terrain would channel their assault into predictable corridors where his machine guns waited. The key was maintaining continuous fire in those corridors, creating a wall of lead that never wavered, making attackers believe they faced impossible odds even when the actual defender numbers told a different story. Private Page checked his ammunition supply one more time. 15 belts of 250 rounds each, 3,750 rounds per gun. In theory, enough for about 6 minutes of continuous fire at 600 rounds per minute. But Page knew the reality would be different. Sustained fire meant short bursts with brief pauses. Ammunition could last for hours if managed properly. The water in his gun's cooling jacket sloshed slightly as he adjusted the weapon's position. That sound, once annoying, now seemed reassuring. The water was there. The gun would keep firing. Around 10 p.m., the jungle fell silent. Birds stopped calling. Insects ceased their endless chirping. The unnatural quiet signaled what every Marine had learned to recognize during their months. On Guadalcanal, the Japanese were close, very close, moving through the darkness with practiced stealth that let them approach within grenade range before launching their assault. Minutes passed in tense silence. Then came the first indication of what was about to hit them. A single shot from a Japanese rifle, then another, scattered firing as forward scouts made contact with American outposts. The preliminary probing lasted perhaps 15 minutes. Then, at 10:30 p.m., the jungle erupted. The Japanese launched their assault with traditional battle cries. Hundreds of voices screaming in unison as infantry charged through the darkness toward American lines. The sound itself was a weapon, designed to terrify defenders and create psychological shock that would paralyze resistance. Many American units had broken under the psychological pressure of a banzai charge combined with overwhelming numbers, but Puller's Marines had prepared for this exact scenario. The M1917 Aoun machine guns opened fire simultaneously. The steady hammering of water-cooled weapons created a sound that drowned out the Japanese battle cries. Each gun fired in controlled bursts, their crews following the training they'd practiced for weeks. Tracer rounds illuminated paths through the darkness, showing gunners where their fire was concentrating. The interlocking fields of fire created zones where Japanese soldiers faced bullets from multiple directions. The assault hit hardest against Puller's Company C, where Basiloni's machine gun section held a critical position. Japanese infantry from the 3rd Battalion's 9th Company charged straight into his firing arc. The veteran troops came in waves, maintaining formation discipline despite casualties. They'd been trained to accept losses and press forward, overwhelm defenders through sheer numerical advantage. But they'd never faced sustained fire from water-cooled machine guns in a prepared defensive position. Within 5 minutes, almost every member of the 9th Company lay dead or dying in front of Basiloni's guns. The machine guns hadn't stopped firing, hadn't paused for barrel changes, hadn't created the gaps the assault tactics required. By 1:25 a.m., Marine Divisional Artillery had found the range on Japanese troop assembly areas. Heavy fire rained down on approach routes, causing massive casualties among units preparing to reinforce the initial assault. The combination of machine gun fire from prepared positions and artillery strikes on approach corridors created a killing system the Japanese couldn't overcome through courage or numerical advantage. But the assault continued. More waves of Japanese infantry charged into the darkness, seeking the breakthrough that would justify their losses. Puller recognized the scale of the attack and requested reinforcements. Division released the 3rd Battalion of the 164th Infantry Regiment, an Army National Guard unit held in reserve. At 3:45 a.m., these soldiers began filtering into Puller's defensive line. They arrived in darkness, in heavy rain, having never fought alongside Marines before. But they moved into position efficiently, guided by runners who knew the defensive layout. The Army troops brought additional firepower and, more importantly, fresh ammunition supplies. Basilione's machine guns had been firing almost continuously for 5 hours. The arrival of reinforcements came at a critical moment. Just before dawn, Colonel Masahiro Furimiya, commander of the 29th Infantry Regiment, managed to penetrate the artillery barrage with 2 companies and his headquarters staff. They reached Pulla's lines around 3:30 a.m., attempting to exploit any weakness in the defensive positions. But there were no weaknesses. The machine guns that had been firing all night were still firing, still maintaining the same steady rate, still creating the same impenetrable barrier that had shattered the initial assault waves. The Japanese soldiers who reached American lines found themselves in a tactical nightmare. They'd advanced through their own casualties, climbed over fallen comrades, endured artillery fire and machine gun bursts to reach what they expected would be disrupted defensive positions. Instead, they found alert Marines and soldiers in prepared bunkers with clear fields of fire and weapons that seemed to have unlimited ammunition. Close-quarters fighting erupted in several positions. Desperate hand-to-hand combat where Japanese soldiers wielding bayonets and swords fought Americans with rifles, pistols, and knives. Basilione's section fought off multiple attempts to overrun their positions. When one machine gun suffered a malfunction, he brought up a replacement, repaired the damaged weapon, then operated it himself until additional crew members could take over. He moved along his line, distributing fresh ammunition belts during lulls in the fighting. The high rates of sustained fire had boiled away water in some cooling jackets. Basilone told his men to urinate in them to keep the weapons operational, a crude field expedient that worked because the guns needed water, any water, to maintain their cooling cycle. As dawn broke on October 25th, the Japanese assault had clearly failed. Bodies carpeted the ground in front of American positions, evidence of the night's carnage. Marine and Army observers counted casualties and realized something extraordinary had occurred. The defensive positions had held. The machine guns had kept firing throughout the entire engagement, and the Japanese had suffered catastrophic losses attempting to overcome firepower they'd never encountered in previous Pacific battles. The tactical significance went beyond simple casualty counts. Pulla's battalion had demonstrated that properly positioned and supported heavy machine guns could defend against forces many times their number. The division's afternoon intelligence summary noted that enemy dead in front of Pulla's and Hall's positions numbered approximately 1,500. The single battalion's defensive sector had inflicted more casualties in one night than most regiments achieved in weeks of combat. Medical teams treating wounded Marines and soldiers documented relatively light casualties among defenders. Fewer than 70 men killed or wounded in Pulla's battalion and the attached army forces. The casualty ratio exceeded 20-1 in favor of the defenders, numbers that would have been considered impossible before the engagement. But the Japanese weren't finished. General Hyakutake refused to accept failure. Throughout October 25th, his staff reorganized surviving units and prepared for another assault. Fresh troops from the 16th Infantry Regiment moved up to reinforce what remained of the assault force. Japanese artillery, carefully conserved during the initial attack, prepared to provide fire support for the next wave. The Americans spent the day improving their positions and redistributing ammunition. Pulla's machine gunners cleaned their weapons, refilled water jackets, and prepared fresh ammunition belts. The M1917A1s had performed flawlessly during the night engagement, but the gunners knew another assault was coming. The weapons' cooling systems had worked perfectly, but ammunition supply had been critically low at several points. The second night would be worse. The Japanese would learn from their mistakes, adjust their tactics, possibly attempt infiltration rather than frontal assault. And Pulla's men were exhausted, fighting all night in rain and mud, limited sleep, the psychological strain of facing overwhelming numbers in darkness. Fatigue would degrade performance even among the best-trained troops. As darkness fell on October 25th, both sides prepared for renewed battle. Japanese infantry moved into assembly areas, their officers reading final attack orders and exhorting soldiers to redemption through victory. American defenders checked their weapons one more time, verified ammunition supplies, and waited for the assault they knew was coming. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The second assault began at 8 p.m. with a fury that exceeded the previous night's attack. The Japanese had learned from their initial failure, but their conclusions led them toward the same tactical mistake. Instead of attempting infiltration or maneuver, they committed their reserve force to frontal assaults against the same defensive positions that had shattered their first wave. The 16th Infantry Regiment, fresh troops who hadn't participated in the previous night's disaster, charged into Pullers and Hall's lines with the same determination their predecessors had shown. And they met the same result. The M1917 Aoun machine guns opened fire. Again, their crews falling into the rhythm established the night before. Controlled bursts, interlocking fields of fire, continuous operation without pause for barrel changes. The water jackets that had kept the guns firing for hours on October 24th performed the same function on the 25th. Metal temperatures that would have disabled air-cooled weapons remained within operational limits thanks to the thermal management the cooling system provided. The weight penalty that made the weapons seem obsolete had again become the feature that made them superior. Marine and Army rifle fire joined the machine guns in creating a defensive barrier the Japanese couldn't penetrate. 37mm anti-tank guns fired canister rounds directly into charging formations, each shell releasing hundreds of metal fragments that acted like enormous shotgun blasts. Mortars dropped rounds on approach routes, forcing Japanese troops to bunch up in areas where machine gun fire was most concentrated. The defensive system Puller had designed worked exactly as intended, multiplying the effectiveness of every weapon through careful positioning and coordination. Sergeant Mitchell Page, commanding another machine gun section northeast of Basilione's position, found himself facing the main weight of the assault around midnight. Japanese infantry overran his supporting positions, killing or wounding Marines on his flanks. For critical minutes, Page's gun stood alone against hundreds of charging enemy soldiers. He maintained fire, working the weapon alone when his crew became casualties. The M1917 Aoun kept functioning, despite the chaos around it, kept firing despite being the sole remaining defensive position in that sector. The weapon's sustained fire capability allowed one man to hold ground that should have required a platoon. Page continued firing until reinforcements arrived, then led a counterattack that drove Japanese forces back from positions they'd temporarily captured. His actions, combined with Basilione's performance the previous night, demonstrated how properly employed machine guns could anchor defensive lines even when surrounding positions failed. The weapons weren't just delivering firepower, they were creating psychological barriers that made attackers hesitate, forcing enemy commanders to commit more troops than tactical situations warranted, drawing Japanese forces into killing zones where American artillery and supporting weapons could maximize casualties. The carnage in front of American lines exceeded anything veteran Marines had witnessed. Japanese soldiers literally climbed over their own dead to continue attacking. Some positions showed bodies stacked 3 and 4 deep, evidence of multiple assault waves hitting the same defensive points. The slaughter achieved nothing tactically. Each wave suffered the same result, cut down by machine gun fire that never stopped, never created the gaps that might have allowed breakthrough. The Japanese military culture that emphasized spirit over firepower, courage over material advantage, was being systematically destroyed by weapons that simply kept firing. Colonel Toshiro Hiroyasu, commander of the 16th Regiment, died, leading his troops in one of the futile assaults. 4 battalion commanders fell with him. Major General Yumio Nasu, commanding the entire assault force, was struck by rifle fire and mortally wounded. The Japanese officer corps, trained to lead from the front, paid a terrible price for tactics that couldn't overcome the defensive firepower Puller's battalion maintained. By 3 a.m. on October 26th, General Hyakutake finally acknowledged reality. His assault had failed completely. The southern attack that was supposed to overwhelm American positions and capture Henderson Field had instead destroyed 2 of his best regiments without achieving any tactical objectives. At 8 a.m., Hyakutake called off further attacks and ordered his forces to retreat. What remained of Maruyama's units, shattered survivors of the Sendai division that had conquered Java without significant losses, withdrew back into the jungle. They left behind approximately 1,500 dead in front of Puller's and Hall's defensive positions. Marine and Army burial details spent the next day dealing with the grim task of disposing of enemy bodies. The tropical heat had already begun the process of decomposition. The smell became overwhelming. Bulldozers were brought up to help with the mass burials, pushing bodies into hastily dug pits that were then covered and marked for later proper internment. The scene shocked even veteran Marines who had seen combat throughout the campaign. One Army soldier from the 164th Infantry described it years later. The carnage of the battlefield was a sight that perhaps only the combat infantryman, who has fought at close quarters, could fully comprehend and look upon without a feeling of horror. Dead Japanese stretched from our positions back along the edge of the jungle for half a mile. The Japanese prisoners captured during the aftermath provided valuable intelligence about why the assault had failed so catastrophically. Several mentioned the continuous fire from American machine guns as particularly demoralizing. They'd been taught that American defenders would eventually run out of ammunition or suffer weapons failures that would create opportunities for successful attacks. Instead, they encountered fire that never diminished, never paused long enough to allow effective movement. The sound of the M1917A1s, firing continuously throughout both nights, had created a psychological effect as devastating as their physical impact. Prisoners described the weapons as thunder guns that seemed to fire without reloading. The distinctive hammering sound had become associated with certain death for anyone attempting to advance. The tactical analysis that followed the battle revealed several factors that contributed to the American victory. Marine Divisional Artillery had fired over 6,000 rounds during the 2 nights of fighting, creating a devastating barrage on Japanese approach routes and assembly areas. The interlocking defensive positions Puller had carefully prepared allowed mutual support between units. The barbed wire obstacles, while not impenetrable, slowed Japanese advances enough to make them easier targets. The night fighting conditions favored defenders who knew their terrain and had prepared firing positions with clear fields of observation. But the single most important factor was the sustained fire capability of the M1917 Aoni machine guns. These weapons had maintained continuous operation throughout 2 nights of desperate combat. They'd fired thousands of rounds without the barrel changes and cooling periods that plagued lighter machine guns. The water cooling system that made them seem obsolete had proven superior to air cooling in the specific environment where the battle occurred. The tropical heat and humidity that reduced air-cooled weapons' effectiveness had no impact on water-cooled performance. The jungle terrain that channeled attacks into predictable corridors perfectly suited the heavy machine guns' fixed defensive employment. Puller's casualties remained remarkably light, fewer than 70 killed and wounded across his battalion and the attached army troops. In 2 nights of combat against forces that outnumbered his unit by more than 3-1, he'd achieved a defensive victory that military analysts would study for decades. The casualty ratio exceeded 20-1, numbers that seemed impossible before the engagement, but were verified by careful counts of enemy dead and American losses. The victory wasn't just tactical, it represented a fundamental shift in how the Marine Corps understood jungle warfare. The weapons that seemed unsuited for mobile operations in dense terrain had proven ideal for defensive operations, where sustained fire mattered more than portability. The M1917 Aoni wasn't obsolete. It was optimized for a different tactical application than peacetime planners had envisioned. For the Marines and soldiers who had fought through those 2 desperate nights, the lesson was simpler and more direct. The old guns kept firing when everything else failed. That made them the best guns. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone received the Medal of Honor for his actions during the battle. The citation specifically credited his role in keeping machine guns operational during critical moments. He'd repaired damaged weapons under fire, brought up replacement guns when primary weapons failed, maintained ammunition supply through dangerous movement across fire-swept ground. Most importantly, he demonstrated the leadership that kept his crews fighting effectively throughout the night. Colonel Puller recommended him and another Marine for the nation's highest military honor. Both recommendations were approved. Puller himself received his Third Navy Cross for commanding the defense. The citation noted his tireless devotion to duty and cool judgment under fire that prevented hostile penetration of American lines. He'd walked his defensive positions throughout both nights, encouraging men, directing fire, coordinating reinforcements. His presence had provided stability during moments when the situation seemed desperate. The battalion commander's reputation, already solid among Marines who served with him, became legendary throughout the division. Sergeant Mitchell Page received the Medal of Honor for his actions on the second night, holding his position alone and leading the counterattack that restored defensive lines. The aftermath of the battle rippled through both Japanese and American planning. For the Japanese, the defeat marked the beginning of the end on Guadalcanal. Hyakutake had committed his best troops to an operation that promised decisive victory. The failure destroyed not just 2 regiments, but the psychological certainty that had driven Japanese expansion across the Pacific. Survivors spread the word that Guadalcanal was an island of death where American firepower overwhelmed courage and tactical skill. Morale throughout Japanese forces in the South Pacific began a decline that would never reverse. The American success demonstrated that properly prepared defensive positions, backed by adequate firepower and artillery support, could hold against numerically superior forces. This wasn't a new lesson in military history, but it was new in the specific context of jungle warfare, where previous engagements had suggested that defensive advantages were minimal. Henderson Field remained in American hands. The airstrip, that had been the objective of 3 major Japanese offensives, continued supporting the Cactus Air Force. Fighters and bombers operating from the field controlled daylight, air, space, and made Japanese resupply operations increasingly costly. The broader strategic implications extended beyond Guadalcanal. The Japanese High Command began reassessing their entire South Pacific strategy. If veteran troops from the Sendai Division couldn't retake one airfield despite numerical superiority, how could they hope to reverse American advances elsewhere? The offensive that had seemed capable of driving Allied forces from the Solomon Islands had instead proven that American defensive capabilities exceeded Japanese offensive power. The balance of the Pacific War had shifted in ways that wouldn't become fully apparent for months, but were nonetheless real and irreversible. For the M1917 Aoni machine gun, the battle represented vindication of a design philosophy that emphasized reliability and sustained performance over theoretical advantages. The weapon had been developed during World War I for trench warfare, where sustained fire was paramount. Military theorists had spent the interwar years arguing that future conflicts would be mobile affairs where lighter weapons held decisive advantages. Guadalcanal proved that tactical environments varied, that some situations favored different characteristics than peacetime planning emphasized. The heavy, water-cooled machine gun was perfect for defensive operations in jungle terrain. The Marine Corps immediately began reassessing machine gun employment throughout the Pacific theater. Units preparing for upcoming operations requested additional M1917A1s for defensive positions, while retaining lighter M1919s for mobile assault roles. The doctrine that emerged from the battle recognized that different tactical situations required different weapons. One size didn't fit all. The goal was matching tools to missions, rather than assuming newer automatically meant better. This represented sophisticated thinking about military technology that many armies struggled to achieve. The technical lessons influenced American weapons development throughout the war. Engineers studying the battle's aftermath understood that sustained fire capability mattered more in some situations than cyclic rate or portability. The balance between firepower, reliability, and tactical flexibility became more nuanced. Weapons designers began thinking more carefully about environmental factors. How would designs perform in tropical heat? In Arctic cold? In desert conditions? The one-size-fits-all approach that had dominated peacetime development gave way to mission-specific optimization. The human cost of the battle, while dramatically lower for Americans than Japanese, still represented tragedy for the families who lost sons, brothers, and fathers. The 70 casualties Puller's forces suffered were 70 individual stories cut short. Men who had enlisted to defend their country, trained for months to prepare for combat, fought bravely in impossible circumstances. Their sacrifice enabled the victory, but came at personal costs that statistics couldn't capture. The Japanese casualties, while enemy combatants, were also men caught in circumstances beyond their control. 1,500 individual lives ended in a futile assault that achieved nothing. The aftermath of the battle saw Puller's battalion finally given time to rest and recover. They'd been in continuous combat operations since arriving on Guadalcanal in September. The physical and mental strain of jungle warfare, combined with the intensity of the October battle, had exhausted even the toughest Marines. Disease was taking a toll comparable to combat casualties. Malaria, dysentery, and other tropical ailments weakened men faster than they could recover. The division medical staff reported that combat effectiveness was declining across all units due to accumulated strain. By early November, the 164th Infantry Regiment and other Army units began relieving Marine positions. The 1st Marine Division had accomplished its mission, captured and held Henderson Field through months of desperate fighting, defeated 3 major Japanese offensives, established air superiority that made continued Japanese operations increasingly difficult, but they'd paid a heavy price. Casualties approached 30% among enlisted men and 50% among officers. The division needed to withdraw to Australia for rest, recovery, and integration of replacements. Puller was wounded on November 8 during a Japanese attack on his command post. Machine gun and artillery fire struck the position, causing arm and leg wounds that required surgery. Command of the battalion passed temporarily to his executive officer. The wounds weren't life-threatening, but they effectively ended Puller's time on Guadalcanal. He'd spent just over 8 weeks in combat on the island. 8 weeks that made him one of the most decorated Marines in the Corps and provided tactical lessons that would influence American military operations for decades. John Basilone became a national hero when news of his Medal of Honor spread through American media. The Marine Corps recognized his propaganda value and brought him back to the United States for war bond tours. Basilone traveled across the country, telling his story and encouraging Americans to support the war effort through bond purchases. The tours raised millions of dollars and boosted civilian morale during a period when the war's outcome remained uncertain. But Basilone chafed at his celebrity status. He'd joined the Marines to fight, not to be a symbol. He repeatedly requested return to combat duty despite offers of safe assignments that would have kept him alive. The battle for Henderson Field's place in military history extended beyond its immediate tactical importance. It demonstrated principles about defensive warfare that remained relevant regardless of technological advancement. Prepared positions multiplied. Firepower effectiveness. Interlocking fields of fire created zones where attackers faced impossible odds. Sustained fire capability mattered more than peak performance in extended engagements. Environmental factors influenced weapons performance in ways that laboratory testing couldn't predict. These lessons were relearned in subsequent conflicts, from Korea to Vietnam to Iraq, each time with costs that might have been reduced if Henderson Field's lessons had been properly internalized. The water-cooled machine gun continued serving throughout World War II in roles where its characteristics provided advantages. Fixed defensive positions. Naval vessel armament, where cooling water was readily available. Situations where sustained fire over extended periods justified the weapon's weight and complexity. The M1917 Aoun didn't replace the lighter M1919. Both weapons coexisted, each optimized for different tactical applications. This represented mature thinking about military equipment that recognized the value of maintaining diverse capabilities. The broader context of the Guadalcanal campaign showed how the October battle fit into the larger strategic picture. Japanese forces made one more major attempt to recapture Henderson Field in mid-November, resulting in the naval battle of Guadalcanal. This engagement saw American naval forces defeat a Japanese bombardment force and troop convoy, inflicting losses that effectively ended Japanese offensive capabilities in the region. By December, the Japanese High Command made the painful decision to evacuate Guadalcanal rather than continue reinforcing failure. The evacuation occurred in February 1943 under harassment by American forces. Henderson Field remained operational throughout this period, its aircraft supporting American operations across the Solomon Islands. The airstrip that 90 Marines with water-cooled machine guns had defended in October became the foundation for American air superiority in the South Pacific. Every bomber that struck Japanese positions, every fighter that engaged enemy aircraft, every reconnaissance mission that provided intelligence operated because Pulla's battalion held their ground on those 2 desperate nights. The strategic importance of the tactical victory exceeded anything participants could have understood during the battle itself. The survivors of Pulla's battalion carried memories of those October nights for the rest of their lives. The sound of machine guns firing continuously, the screams of Japanese soldiers charging through darkness, the smell of gunpowder and blood mixing with tropical rain, the exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue into something approaching spiritual depletion. But they also carried pride in having achieved something remarkable. 90 Marines with obsolete weapons had defeated 1,500 enemy soldiers through superior preparation, courage, and equipment that worked when it mattered most. The M1917 Aoni machine gun's role in the battle became part of Marine Corps legend. The weapon appeared in training manuals as an example of how older equipment could outperform modern designs in specific situations. Gun crews practiced on the water-cooled weapons even as newer models entered service. The institutional knowledge about sustained fire techniques and cooling system maintenance was passed from veterans to new Marines. The weapon itself became a symbol of the principle that effectiveness mattered more than novelty, that sometimes the best solution was the oldest one, proven through decades of service. The Japanese Sendai Division never recovered from its losses at Henderson Field. The unit that had conquered Java with minimal casualties had been effectively destroyed in 2 nights of futile assaults. Survivors were withdrawn to rear areas where they spent months rebuilding from scattered remnants. The division's tactical doctrine, emphasizing spirit and bayonet charges over firepower, was quietly revised to acknowledge the reality that courage alone couldn't overcome prepared defenses and superior weapons. The lessons came too late to change the war's trajectory, but represented painful acknowledgement that pre-war assumptions had been wrong. General Hyakutake survived the battle, but his reputation never recovered. He'd promised decisive victory and delivered catastrophic defeat. His assurances that American defenders would crumble under determined assault had proven completely wrong. The general continued serving in the South Pacific, but was never again entrusted with major offensive operations. His failure at Henderson Field marked the end of Japanese offensive capabilities on Guadalcanal and represented a turning point in the Pacific War as significant as Midway, but less recognized in popular histories. The water that cooled the M1917 Aon machine guns during those October nights was ordinary, water from jungle streams and wells. Nothing special. Nothing that seemed significant in the moment, but that water, circulating through cooling jackets and absorbing heat generated by thousands of rounds fired in sustained bursts, made the difference between victory and defeat. The simple physics of thermal management, understood for decades but overlooked in favor of lighter designs, proved decisive in a battle that shaped the Pacific War's outcome. Sometimes the most important factors are the simplest ones. Sometimes water matters more than steel. The legacy of the battle extended into how the Marine Corps thought about adaptation and innovation. The willingness to employ weapons that seemed obsolete because they fit the tactical situation demonstrated intellectual flexibility that many military organizations lacked. This flexibility allowed the Marines to outperform enemy forces that possessed superior numbers and equal courage, but were bound by doctrine that didn't adapt to circumstances. The lesson was clear. Victory came from matching tools to tasks, not from assuming that newest automatically meant best. This principle influenced American military thinking throughout the 20th century and remains relevant today. For the machine gunners who fought through those 2 nights, The experience created bonds that lasted their entire lives. Men who had served together in Puller's battalion held reunions decades after the war, gathering to remember friends lost and victories earned. They spoke of the battle with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Pride in what they'd accomplished, sorrow for the price paid and the memories they could never fully escape. The sound of machine guns firing remained in their dreams, sometimes welcome, sometimes terrifying, always present. The M1917 Aoun gradually phased out of service as World War II ended and new weapons entered the American arsenal. By Korea, most had been replaced by designs that incorporated lessons learned during the Pacific fighting. But the weapon's legacy endured in the principles it validated. Sustained fire capability mattered. Thermal management was critical. Environmental factors influenced performance. Different missions required different tools. These lessons, purchased with blood on Guadalcanal, shaped American small arms development for generations. The night of October 24th through 26th, 1942, represented one of those moments where individual courage, proper equipment, and tactical wisdom combined to create results that seemed impossible beforehand. 90 Marines shouldn't have stopped 1,500 attacking Japanese soldiers. The mathematics of combat suggested they would be overwhelmed. But they had water-cooled machine guns that kept firing when everything else failed. They had a commander who understood how to position those weapons for maximum effect, and they had the courage to stand their ground during 2 nights of desperate fighting. The combination proved sufficient. Barely, but sufficient. Henderson Field remained in American hands. The airstrip continued operations. Japanese offensive capability on Guadalcanal ended. The strategic balance in the South Pacific shifted permanently in favor of Allied forces. All because water circulating through machine gun cooling jackets absorbed heat and allowed sustained fire during critical hours. All because Marines stood their ground with weapons that military theorists considered obsolete. All because sometimes the oldest solution is also the best one. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.